Hi, this is Dr. Clue. I'm with the Bubsy fan blog on Atari Age, and with me is my partner in crime, Sponge Fox.
Hello.
And today we have a special guest. If you'll please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Faran Thomason. I was the producer of the Jaguar version of Bubsy at Atari.
And you've also worked on a couple of other games, too, while you're at Atari. Go ahead and talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I started Atari as a tester, so some of the games that I tested were Port of Lemmings, Jimmy Connor's Tennis, Malibu Beach Volleyball, I think Road Riot 4x4, although I'm not sure if that one ever made it to market. Worked on some of the Jaguar titles like Trevor McFur and Cybermorph, Dino Dudes, the Supercross game, Baldies. Those are just the ones I can recollect off the top of my head.
Cybermorph. Just, if you don't mind, indulge me just for a minute. What was it like working on Cybermorph? Because that's actually one of my other favorite games.
Oh, yeah, Cybermorph was a lot of fun. I think what made it unique was that it was probably one of the first 3D games on the market. Definitely one of the first 3D console games, and definitely one of the first free roaming console games. And for better or for worse, I would say the developers, ATD, didn't have a complete vision of what they wanted for the game, so it allowed the testers to provide a lot of feedback into the game. So not only were we testing the game, but we were also designing a lot of the levels. Atari also provided the audio samples of the co-pilot, so it was a great way to kind of get involved in all aspects of the video game production process. So, I have a lot of fond memories, even though we worked a lot of hours, probably 16, 20-hour days at some point to get it out the door because it had to, be the pack-in title. And, there were lead times for the manufacturing. So we had to work a ton of overtime just to make sure that we got the game out the door.
What kind of things changed in Cybermorph as you were going through the play testing and development?
Offhand, I don't really recall. I think they always wanted it to be a free roaming game. I suspect that at some point there was a grandiose vision of having it texture mapped instead of garo shaded. But at some point in the development, I think everybody realized that that wasn't going to happen. But I'm not 100% sure of that. But as I recall, obviously games, other games definitely on the PC like Doom or Wolfenstein at the time, had some limited forms of texture mapping, and there weren't a lot of garo shaded games, so we did want it to be competitive in the marketplace. But I also think that the fact that we had a completely full 3D world, which you could go back, forth, up and down, was also something very unique in the marketplace that we could provide, that everybody kind of got over the lack of texture mapping and kind of put their effort into kind of making the coolest garo shaded game that we could. And everybody put a lot of time into making levels. Basically it was all hands on board. Everybody remotely related to production was cranking out levels for the game. And much like Trevor McFur, it was probably a lot of all hands on deck in terms of the testing of the game as well.
So did you come up with any of the level designs for that?
Yeah, I think I did a few. I don't recall quite what made it into the game or what haven't. I mean, honestly, I haven't played that game probably since it came out. So I'm not sure what was left on the cutting room floor, but I would say almost everybody in the production department contributed a level or two to that game. And, maybe somebody else could fill you a little bit more in on the details.
Yeah, I actually played it this last weekend, got through it in about 2.5 hours. At one time, it took me about 5 days, so I've been playing it a while.
Yeah, that's the thing. And also, that's the kind of thing about the older video games in terms of game length of play. As testers, we were all pretty much hardcore gamers back in the day, and we could start beating the game since we worked on it from the first alpha submission or pre-alpha submissions till when the game was out the door. We could always beat it so quickly. A lot of times we'd have them probably unfairly jack up the difficulty levels of the games. I felt that you'll find that in a lot of games, definitely like Bubsy. So Bubsy, probably for a game that at least superficial looks like it's for 8 or 9-year-old kids, but it's ridiculously difficult. But part of it is because in the UK they had such a hardcore game culture with the Psygnosis games like Shadow of the Beast, and you have all the testers that play all those games, that the difficulty of the games gets ramped up probably out of proportion to what it should be for the target audiences. And I think the same thing probably happened with Cybermorph as well.
Well, there's also this knack in the 90s of wanting to be extreme, wanting to be challenging. We got 15 challenging levels, you know, and that was a big thing back then. You know, harder than this other game.
Exactly, and you get caught up in that mindset. Sometimes I think if you could execute it well, it's probably fair, but if it's difficulty for difficulty's sake, where you make a lot of the gameplay objectives just kind of flat out cheap, I'm sure it tends to work against you. And I know that we were culprits of doing that on a few of our products.
And that explains a lot, really. A lot of Jaguar games are of that ilk where you have to invest a certain amount of time to get good at it. That's the way it was a lot of Jaguar games. Good games if you put in the time.
And I don't think it was necessarily just Jaguar. I'm pretty sure there was a ton of Super Nintendo and Genesis games because a lot of those games were made by the same people. So I believe it was Imagitec that did Bubsy. They did Dino Dudes, they did Raiden, and I'm pretty sure they did other iterations of those games for other platforms as well as other conversions or games for other publishers. So at that time, a lot of people were still going to the same pool of developers to make the games. So they all had these same kind of difficulty curves because the same people were making the games.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, those are your days as a tester, and I understand that from a tester you went on to be a producer.
Right. I think the cool thing about being in the video game industry at that time was that it was going through a pretty big boom phase. So it was one of those times where actually you could still come in on the ground floor as a tester and then work your way up to the ranks. So like if you want to become a producer, designer, or a programmer or artist, you could still get in by being a tester and work your way up the ladder to any one of those positions. So for me, I went from tester to producer and still had some input on the design. As I said, definitely within things like Cybermorph and probably things like Lemmings, where we were able to influence some of the user interface and game mechanics as they translated the game from like the Amiga version to the Lynx version. And we were able to add input on, you know, how the player controlled the various things on the screen, since you had to select through a menu of different icons and characters. Translating that was a little tricky.
That brings up a very interesting point now. And I'm going to take a side tangent just for a minute because I like both the Lynx and the Amiga. I actually belong to an Amiga chapter here in Dallas. I know a lot of the Lynx development actually was done on Amigas.
Right. As I recall, the guys that created the Lynx were some of the creators or the creators of the Amiga. So I believe that they probably had the same design philosophy, at least as how they created the hardware and displaying things on the screen. So it was probably pretty easy for a lot of the UK developers that had cut their teeth on the Ataris and the Amigas to get up to speed to programming things on the Lynx and the Jaguar.
Okay. So do you remember what the similarities were between the Amiga and Lynx versions of Lemmings?
I think it was a pretty good port, as I recall, but obviously on the Amiga you were using the mouse to control the cursor to scroll the screen as well as to click the various things on the bottom of the screen. So we had to translate that interface into using the D-pad on the Lynx to be able to control every aspect of the screen. So we spent a lot of time and worked with the coder quite a bit to get that fine-tuned and so that it played great. And I think Lemmings was probably one of the better Lynx games. I think it came at the end of the life cycle of the Lynx, so they probably didn't make too many of them, and that's probably why it's a rare cartridge. And probably if you want it new, it's probably like $200 or $300 if you get it off of eBay.
Yeah, I was talking to Trevor Raysford at one time. You know, he did like the music engine, I understand. A lot of mod support. He was talking about how when they were switching over from Zool from Amiga to the Jaguar, it was, he said for the most part, a kind of a rewrite.
That's interesting because I think Amiga and the Jaguar were both 68,000, as I recall. So kind of tangenting back to Bubsy.
Yeah.
I think part of why Atari got involved in the Accolade deal was because they had a lot of Genesis source code, and I think the Genesis was also 68,000 based. So there was a lot of commonalities in terms of being able to port over the code easier. I mean, granted, it's always easier said than done.
Of course.
And in general, I think the motto at Atari was that we didn't want the developers to rely exclusively on the 68,000. We wanted them to use all the different chips. But of course, the developers sometimes took the path of least resistance to getting things up and running really quickly and getting the game out as fast as they could, because obviously a lot of the deadlines were really tight that we had to work with.
Oh, yeah. I've got something really fun to share with you, speaking of the various chips. Okay, so as I mentioned, there was the source code that I got, and in there was a folder called Jaguar Specific, and there was one for the blitter, and there was a little programmer comment, and it says, according to the golden rule of Atari, thou shalt not use blitter whilst within the interrupt. Take heed. But I thought that was kind of funny, the golden rule of Atari for the blitter.
Exactly, and I think that obviously the Jaguar had a few quirks or bugs in the chips. So, I think there are philosophical reasons, and then there are actual real reasons. If you did things a certain way, everything would break and would be a bigger pain in the ass. So I also think the developers in the UK definitely like to, as they say, take the piss. So I'm sure this was just their slightly passive-aggressive way of getting back at Atari.
For giving them the chipset that they gave them to deal with, huh?
Exactly. And maybe not. So Imagitec was one of the good and the bad. Imagitec was they were developers on the Lynx, and thus they were able to get it on the ground floor of the Jaguar. Mm-hmm. But Imagitec, not to cast too many aspersions, but like the early 90s developers, especially people that were overseas, especially the ones that Atari hired, a lot of them were low bidders. So basically what they would do is they would bid low enough to where they got enough money, but they would know that they bid low enough to get the contract. Then they would hire super junior programmers right out of college or high school to do the work. And that way they could save money on programming fees because they're not hiring experienced programmers to do those jobs. So they would have the experienced programmer read the documentation, but they would have them on all their more expensive, higher profile projects. And then they would have the junior guys actually doing all the work for Atari.
Well, that sounds like pretty much any corporation I can think of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know what? I mean, so when I worked at Nintendo, even though Nintendo didn't necessarily pay a lot for work for hire contracts, we had a lot more oversight of the people that were on the project. They had to send us a lot more documentation of the who, where, why, what was going on any particular project. So, like, there was a little bit more oversight, and thus people they weren't intentionally trying to pull the wool over our eyes, and we did a lot more due diligence to make sure that wouldn't happen. Whereas at Atari, there were all kind of shenanigans going on. And, I think it kind of showed in the game somewhat. But I think for a junior programmer, I think that it allowed them to get a lot of experience and unique experience, even if it probably was more work and more difficult than they could handle or should have handled.
I've liked what I've heard here so far. I mean, you've talked about how you could go up the ladder at Atari, how there were positions, the art positions, the producer positions. I mean, apparently these were all established things that you could shoot for while you're at Atari.
Oh, no. All this was kind of seated at everybody's pants, to be perfectly honest. So basically, all the internal projects would be started by some of the various factions within the company. So the art department had its projects that it wanted to do. The programming staff had its projects. The Tremels had their projects. Other people had their projects. And so it was kind of always this kind of weird, like, battle of who could get the resources. And then if you got short of resources, well, then you'd have to do double duty. So sometimes the artists would be doing designs, or sometimes the art department, like, well, you know what, we're going to do this. This is going to be our project. We're going to take total ownership. And in doing that, it meant all of the burden of responsibility of the management of the project was on them. And same with the programming department. So it was actually pretty chaotic. But, when you're young, it's an interesting environment to be in because you kind of get to see how the sausage is made.
Right. Yep. And that's why this is so fascinating. We definitely want to know how the sausage was made. So how many people would you say worked at Atari? I mean, was one main building, or was it multiple buildings, or what was
So at that point, I'd say 90% of the staff was stuffed into, I don't remember which building it was, but it was maybe 1196 Borregas. I'm not sure. That's just the number that's popping into my head. And so on one floor, we had the game development. So that would include the programming, the testing, producers, artists. And then outside of those guys would be some of just the regular tools. But those guys would probably be doing tools for not only the Jaguar, but also for the TTs and the Falcons, which I think we're still supporting, if not manufacturing at the time. And then there was just your basic administration. And then below was kind of like the PR and third-party support. So it was a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. And like I said, a lot of that was overlap. You had a lot of people that were kind of supporting multiple projects and multiple platforms simultaneously. And there was audio. So we did have an audio department. And obviously Atari was known for its audio. So a lot of people in the company played music. So sometimes they'd have these informal jam sessions. So it was an interesting place to be. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was pretty crazy. But at the same time, it had like a pretty interesting vibe to it.
Yeah, I had kind of a similar experience in my work. And I work in kind of a retail headquarters, but it was just kind of a neat thing of walking down the hall one time, and there was a guy that hooked up a Raspberry Pi with an emulator on it. And he said they're playing a 2600 game. So, yeah, I know what it's like to kind of be in that office environment and have kind of fun sidebar stuff going on.
Exactly. It's a super relaxed environment, not as infamous as like those old school days of the 2600 where people were in like hot tubs snorting coke. Like, it never quite got that out of control, but it probably got pretty close.
So, I mean, that was really a thing, huh? Back in those days.
I wasn't really around then, but I don't doubt those stories. They're probably true.
The Time Warner days, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Yeah, I could see that. So, hey, talking about the source code, talking about Imagitec and how they had the Genesis code and everything, that will actually segue us to another good part of this, where we talk about the Bubsy code and how it came from Claws Encounters of the Third Kind, originally. You know, the first Bubsy game.
Right.
And from what I understand, you know, when, of course, the fortune of talking to you on the Atari Age forums, and we talked to Andrew Seed, who was one of the programmers.
I think he was probably the only programmer, but yeah.
He was the only one, huh?
I think there was probably some support and like some audio, but like it goes back to the story I'm pretty sure this was the first major thing that he had done. And He had to pretty much carry all the weight himself. I'd say that pretty much all those initial Atari produced games,
yeah,
it was very similar stories.
I'm looking at the Bubsy manual in front of me here and looking at the credits. And they show Andrew Seed for the programming. They show him for character design. I'm sure he's probably in testing, probably somewhere. There you are, producer. And yeah, and of course, a pretty good list of people. But yeah, under programming, he's it.
Yeah. So I believe that there was some other people like Sound Tools, and there was probably... So Imagitec had their own level design tool.
Yeah.
So I believe some of the levels would be sketched out on graph paper, but they also had a tool, I'm not sure what, was probably running on a PC, and it allowed you to edit the levels and the collision and everything and save it to a file, which then would get compiled into the game.
Very cool. Well, as the story goes, the Claws Encounters of the Third Kind, as the source code was brought over, they had the first level kind of with a rudimentary map, but it was running without enemies or working AI, and at some point it was decided, it was originally advertised to be Claws Encounters, but then the game story shifted. So what caused the shift? What do you remember of that one?
Okay, here I'll try to recollect things to the best of my ability.
Oh, please do.
So right as Trevor McFur and Cybermorph were wrapping up, I believe probably Sam Trammell went to the president of Accolade to get a deal. And I'm not sure whether the intent was for Accolade to make the games or what. That part I don't know. But either way, we ended up with the rights to do maybe half a dozen different Accolade games. The Charles Barkley, Rhett Hull, Hockey, Bubsy, Hardball. We had all these games. They gave us the art and the source code, and they were kind of dragging their feet on every aspect of this. So
I know that goes.
So I suspect that the original intent from somebody was to do quick and right. Okay, so it's all a little bit coming back to me. I believe probably the original intent was to do quick and dirty ports of all these games because they were all more or less on the Genesis. So you'd have that lift of being able to do the job quickly because you already had the source code that could run on 68,000.
Exactly, yeah.
So we're sitting here with all this stuff, and everybody thought that Bubsy was already kind of past its prime. Why would we want to come out with a Genesis port of Bubsy? That would make everybody look bad. Like, why would we want to do this? So, like, we decided that we should change the game, keep the basic premise, but change the concepts in the game. I think at some point there was probably some talk of Accolade maybe giving us the Bubsy 2 source code, but my guess is it was not compatible within the time frame that we had to work with. Either they were late in giving us the code or we didn't have the rights to that particular code, but there was some reason that we couldn't use the Bubsy 2 source code. So what we did was we based the Jaguar game off of the source code of the original Bubsy and then changed the art and the graphics and as much of the gameplay as that we could within the time frame so that we could get it out, I don't know if it was before Christmas or as close to Christmas as humanly possible.
Oh yeah, I think you got it out by Christmas. That much did happen.
Right. And so I think there was a mandate to do that, was to get it out before Christmas because there was less value to the game after Christmas. So there was a big push to get it out. I remember I went over and visited Imagitec. I believe Andy Seed might have also come to the Atari offices in Sunnyvale to help get the game out on time.
Yeah, from what I've gathered, Bubsy 2 and Fractured Furry Tales were, I think, being worked on probably about the same time, really. They were.
That could have been it then. Maybe Accolade wasn't done with Bubsy 2. There was some reason, and it just didn't fit into the schedule, and it's possible we did not have the rights to use the Bubsy 2 source code, so we quickly changed paths to what we got on the Jaguar.
Yeah. I'm taking a quick look here, and it looks like Bubsy 2 was released on October 28th, 1994, and Fractured Furry Tales was released on December 15th, 1994. You got out just in time for Christmas.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have been feasible for either party to... So, like, Accolade wouldn't have had the resources to kind of, like, baby step us through their code while they're trying to ship their game. So I'm pretty sure that's why we put the kibosh on that idea.
I'm sure, if anything, they were busy trying to hash out their own playtesting and source codes and everything. So they probably weren't even close to being finished while you guys were mid-development.
Exactly. And we wanted to get started and get it out, so it was like too complicated and not time efficient to change paths during development.
That makes perfect sense. Let's see here, as far as all that goes. Okay, so had the Bubsy 1 source code, Bubsy 2 source code was not available. Now here's a fun bit of trivia, of course, that I picked up at some point, and one that the maker of the podcast would definitely like to know more about, and that is the struggle of trying to shoehorn in the Nerf gun in about mid-development, because Bubsy 2 had the Nerf gun, and from what I've gathered, I think Atari wanted to kind of cash in on that Nerf marketing and some of the stuff that was going on with Bubsy 2. So do you remember any of the fun with that one?
I think it's basically kind of the same thing. I think that obviously the source code, the code to make Bubsy shoot the gun was too complicated to kind of insert into the game midstream. So it just wasn't going to happen. I suspect, I don't really recall it too much. I don't think that we considered it. I'm pretty sure that we asked them and then we all agreed that it wasn't a great idea, because you'd have to actually change all of the mechanics to the game to make it a game where you could hop on people versus a game where you could shoot and hop on people. So that changes the whole strategy and ideology of how you design the levels and the game mechanics. So there's no real easy way to shoehorn it in. And I think at some point we're like, this just isn't going to happen. let's just stick with the framework of the original Bubsy.
Totally agree. Having played both the first Bubsy and second Bubsy games and comparing it to Jaguar Bubsy, I can say that gravity in the first game and the Jaguar game feel a lot the same. The Jaguar game's a little zippier, I think because of processors that the Jaguar uses. And Bubsy 2, it's obvious that their source code was very different. And the gravity seems a little stricter. You don't quite get the nice flow or the nice gliding ability like you kind of experience in the first and third game. So I mean that's just an observation from a gamer. And I have to say too that really the Nerf gun didn't add too much. You could pick up the Nerf gun, you could blast a few enemies, and you run out of ammo, and then you wind up just bopping people in the end anyway. So it kind of actually slowed down the flow of the game, if you ask me.
My guess is, and this is pure speculation on my part, just from like being in the industry, I suspect they were in the same boat, and some marketing person at Accolade was like, "Holy cow! I just talked to Nerf. Wouldn't it be a great idea if Bubsy could have a Nerf gun?" And then that person had more seniority than the person that actually had to implement it, and thus a Nerf gun is in Bubsy.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, that's my guess. I don't know. Could be complete conjecture on my part, but typically that's kind of how those things go, especially things that just seem very tacked on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, we've worked in those environments, so we know how that goes. Hey, let's see here. We can pause on that just for a moment, and let's get a couple of questions in. Hey, Sponge Fox, you still with us?
Yes.
Well, grab one of the questions out of the hat, and let's see what we can find out from these questions.
Okay.
Sponge Fox here is, like I say, part of the Bubsy fan blog, and is a pretty good cartoonist, artist, and all that, and has actually been quite inspired by the Bubsy design amongst other cartoon characters.
One cool thing, though, was that we did get the original artist, I believe it was Ken Macklin, to do the box art.
Really?
I think that's what his name was. If I'm incorrect, I apologize.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it does look a lot like the other ones. Like I'm looking at Bubsy 2 right now. The box art for that one, and I'm looking at the one for Fractured Furry Tales. Yeah, they look almost identical. Matter of fact, it's almost like they kind of took the same Bubsy sprite and then added other characters and such to it. Yeah, it looks very similar.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it was mandated by our contract or whether we wanted to keep the continuity of the look throughout all the games. But we were able to contact him, and then he was able to generate the artwork for the box art.
That's pretty cool. So as the producer, how much control did you have over such marketing things like the box art and the manual and all that?
So, as I was saying before, the people downstairs did a lot of that marketing PR and did a lot of the box art. So basically, they would subcontract out to another company. I want to say it was called Bobot, as I recall. We would write the manual, and then usually the testers would write the manual, and then we would give it to these guys, and then they would give it to the subcontractor, who would then rewrite the manual and format it correctly to fit within the set amount of pages that was allotted for the manual. And they would also contract with somebody to do the box art. I believe in this case, I went through Accolade to get Ken Macklin's contact information, and I think I contacted him myself in conjunction with the staff that did the box art, and then we paid him, and he did the box art.
Oh, fantastic! So you actually hunted him down yourself on that one.
Yeah, I want to say that we wanted the continuity to make it look like it belonged in the Bubsy family, but Accolade might have mandated that we use them as well. Like, since it's their character, they want the continuity. They want to make everything look like it all belongs in the same world together.
Yeah, I did a really good job. I mean, I've got various Bubsy versions on my shelf. From the Mega Drive to Genesis, Nintendo, Super NES, Jaguar, and they look really nice. When you take the three of them, the first Bubsy, second Bubsy, and the third Bubsy, and you look at the edge of them, they match each other pretty nicely, especially with that Bubsy logo. So, good job. Hey, Sponge Fox, you got a question ready for us?
Does he still have any of the screenshots he worked on from the Fractured Furry Tales games?
So actually, I have very little of anything from when I was at Atari. I think I don't know if I sold them to you. I don't know if that's how you found out. I had some Bubsy stuff. I think I might have like sold them on eBay or something.
Ooh.
That was like maybe 10 years ago. I feel, but it was very limited. It was like, maybe it was a map.
Okay, were you the one that sold the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea map?
I have no idea.
or yeah, it was a level map though. It was like a big, huge graph paper.
Yeah, I think I had that. I think I had a Bubsy level map, which I don't have anymore. I think maybe I had a Baldi's character. So I don't know if you played Baldi's, but one of the unique aspects of Baldi's was that it had stop motion animation.
Yeah.
So the company that made it did the animation, and they had all of the little models and maquettes that they used. So I think they gave me one. So I might have had one of those lying around someplace.
Oh, how
But
cool.
in general, for whatever reason, I think I had very little things from my days at Atari. I don't even have a Jaguar. I have a copy of Bubsy, but that's about it.
Well, all right. It kind of reminds me of my Atari ST collection, which right now only consists of a Spectre GCR cartridge, because I like Spectre GCR, it's a Mac emulator for the ST. And mainly I kept it because I like the manual. The manual is actually fun to read. Dave Small wrote that, and he was actually quite funny. So yeah, I know what it's like just to hang on to it. And of course, if nothing else, the Bubsy cartridge would look good on your shelf, or
Exactly.
some knick-knack thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have that on my shelf, and I do wish that I'd kept more of the relics and knickknacks. Some of the other people on the Atari forum have all kinds of crazy stuff, especially the people there, like I guess the person that got that source code, the people that were there on the last days. It was like a bonanza for random Atari stuff. So I suspect a lot of that stuff is still out there floating around, little interesting trinkets and prototypes and artwork and things like that.
Hey, here's a question for you. We've talked about marketing. Do you know if there's any promotional items for the Bubsy games? For example, the first game had the T-shirt, and I think there was something else that you could get. And I managed to find the shirt. The second Bubsy game had also another shirt, and actually had a little portable hole. It was basically a fold-up frisbee. Do they make anything for Fractured Furry Tales of that kind of stuff?
So here's the thing. For Accolade, Bubsy was their Sonic, their Mario.
True.
So from that standpoint, they put a ton of money. I think, wasn't there even a Bubsy cartoon?
Yes.
As I recall.
There was.
So they put a lot of money and effort into Bubsy from Accolade's perspective because it was their top tier game. From our perspective, it was just another conversion, much like Raiden and Dino Dudes and other games that existed on other platforms before coming to the Jaguar.
Okay.
So it wasn't like, it's not like Atari spent a ton of money marketing anything. So for sure in the heck, they weren't going to like start kicking down tens of thousands of dollars for Bubsy t-shirts.
Fair enough. I kind of figured that was the case, but I just wanted to kind of squelch that one from the source here, so I appreciate that. Well, Sponge Fox, how about another question?
Oh, mind if I look at the blogs? I can read one back.
Sure, go ahead. Now, I will say this while she's looking for another question. I'll go ahead and mention one of the questions I remember somebody asking about, and I can answer this one. The question often comes up, why was Bubsy's shirt, didn't have the red exclamation point, but had like the dingy yellow exclamation point? And the answer is, it's because of the original Bubsy source code. The way it worked was, there was a option, if you were player 1, the exclamation point was red, and if you were player 2, the exclamation point was green. So, matter of fact, I have the source code right here, and in this one file called BUBCTRLS, Bubsy controls, you look in just a little bit, and it actually has a little notation that says select Bubsy palette based on player. Apparently that was a value that happened, and the yellow that you see is a null field that would be assigned a color based on the player number. And now we know. I'm sure you've been asked that many times over the years.
Yeah, exactly. I think almost every day somebody comes up and asks me.
Well,
now you got an answer.
Okay, here's one that I have for you. Did you have any favorite music tracks from the Fractured Furry Tales game?
I wish I could say I recalled them. I think that Imagitec, that was one of the things that they took care of because I think they were proud of their audio. However, one thing I can say is everybody got annoyed at the Bubsy voice samples. So I was at Atari, 1994-ish, that's roughly 20 years ago.
Sure.
One of the testers that worked on the game, I run into him periodically now that I live in San Francisco. And he'll just come up behind me and just like scream, "What could possibly go wrong?" Like 20 years later. Because
Ooh.
A, he's annoying, and B, it's all those Bubsy voice tracks after a while became so annoying that people just kept repeating them to each other just to annoy other people. So
Actually, I don't mind the "what could possibly go wrong." I like that phrase.
I think a true Bubsy fan would like that.
that is true.
It's kind of the catchphrase.
That is the catchphrase. But you hear that, I don't know, 10, 20, 100, 200 times a day. And you know what? It does get a tad bit annoying.
Oh, I imagine. I tell you what what got annoying as I was playing Bubsy for the first time was the Hansel and Gretel levels. They always say, "Nothing can stop us now," and I'm like, oh my gosh, what hasn't stopped me at this point? You know, I'm going through, I'm dying by pies, I'm dying by bees, I'm dying by falling, you know, and fire and everything else. Yeah, I think a lot of stuff can stop us now. No offense, but yeah.
I'm sorry, but I had to really make a pun about that level. I'm very sorry, Clue. But, you know, did you say you were dying in that level with the candy and everything?
Yeah, that was a candy level.
Well, it's called the diabetes level. No offense. It's diabetes.
I think that we had a limited amount of samples and then just tried to apply them where we could.
Yeah, fair enough. That was Brian Silva's work, you know, from the first Bubsy game.
Right.
And
So I think we had all those, and then I don't know if we had any space limitations, but we just tried to pick and choose whichever ones were going to match best with wherever we could place them in the particular levels.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I preferred his voice tracks. Rob Paulson was good. I liked him enough, but I did like Brian Silva's a little bit more as Bubsy. But maybe, of course, I started off on the Jaguar games. That's probably why. Well, got how about another question for us?
Let's see.
Believe it or not, we actually had 3 people submit questions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Two are from me.
Not counting me. So,
Oh boy.
well, you look for a question. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question of my own now. So here's a fun one. And this is one of the ones I told you about already. So I'm looking through the source code once again, and the level arrangement was a little different in the source code. Starting with Alibaba is rolled 1, and then of course Jack and the Beanstalk always is rolled 2, so nothing changed there. Rolled 3 was Hansel and Gretel. Rolled 4 was the water levels, so I guess that was always a thing. And then the 5th level was, or rolled 5 as it's called, was Alice in Wonderland. So, do you remember what came about with the reshuffling of these levels?
Not offhand. I don't know if it was a matter of that the Alice in Wonderland was done last or felt the easiest or some other arbitrary reason. I guess one of the dirty secrets is that it's not like, this wasn't like a Sergio Miyamoto Nintendo game where everything is thought out in exact precision. This was kind of seat of our pants, and maybe there's some arbitrary reason why the levels came out that way. I'm pretty sure it wasn't terribly strategic. It was probably a very simple reason, like, oh, this one ended up being done first, and this one ended up being done last. And when he made his list of levels within the game, that's how he had them written in the source code, but maybe the artist or whatever didn't come with all the assets at a specific time, and thus things got shifted around. I'm pretty sure there was no deep underlying meaning or strategy to any of it.
Okay. Well, let me ask this. You know, when you have all these, the 5 different worlds, and I'm sure it was kind of one of those things, let's make an Alice in Wonderland level. Let's make one based off 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for a water level. just for a variety of environments. Do you remember if there are any other worlds or environments that obviously didn't make it that were being pondered?
I have to assume that was the case, but I couldn't remember any of them. I bet we came up with a big list, and somehow it got narrowed down, and there was probably a plan for one or two that didn't make the game, probably because of space or scheduling reasons. But as I said, this was all very seat of our pants, and a lot of things get lost in the shuffle, and at the end of the day, you just run out of time and have to ship the product.
Absolutely. So, Sponge Fox?
There was one I wanted to ask. Like, did he ever wish Bubsy had a better game himself, personally? You know, like, make better controls and maybe add a character or two?
So I think when we're doing all of the initial design, everybody has grandiose ideas of what can be done. And one of the things about Imagitec that they were notorious for was over-promising and under-delivering.
Okay.
So I suspect at the initial meetings, they were probably promising all kinds of crazy, innovative gameplay, but reality takes over, and kind of what you see is what you get. You know, it would always be great to be able to sit down and fine-tune the controls a little bit better, make things a little bit nicer, tune the difficulty, but at the end of the day, you just have to kind of get the product out the door. And I think they did a great job given the constraints that they had and the budget and the time. And it was good to get the source code, which obviously gave us a head start. But unfortunately, you can't do all of the things that you would like to do.
Yeah, of course, especially with 2 meg limitation.
Right, yeah. So you also, that's right, I completely forgot. You also have the cartridge limitations. I'm sure that we were clamoring to make things more 16 or 24-bit like Trevor McFur, but that wasn't going to be realistic within the space and the time, nor would it have probably synced up with what Accolade provided us within the source code. So even if we wanted to make a hyper-realistic Bubsy, it just was not going to be something that could happen within the constraints that we're working with for the project.
Oh, yeah. Definitely understood. All right, so Sponge Fox found a picture of you, I guess, working on Bubsy at some point. So, yeah, tell us about that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was me over in the UK visiting Imagitec, or it was me in the Atari offices. I'm not exactly sure. But basically, I think it was just a picture of me pretending to work just for my own records and amusement, just so I remember the experience.
So that wasn't a day in the life for you, huh?
Yeah, and I was just reviewing the art. So a lot of the process would be they would either send us a file which we would run on the debugger, or they would send over the art files. And if it was the art files, we'd look, I think at that point, it probably was Deluxe Paint. And then I just review the artwork, give my comments. Sometimes I would send it over to Accolade. They would look at it, mark it up, give their comments, and then I would send it back to Imagitec. They would make the changes, wash, rinse, repeat, basically.
You know, typical day in the life of the office there.
Exactly. And sometimes I would go to Accolade in person to get the approvals. I'd bring over a Jaguar and we could review everything in person. Sometimes it would just be done via email. I would just send them some files.
Yeah, I guess email was kind of a thing then. I mean, it was just barely a thing though, right?
Well, I'd been on email when I was in college, so that was late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And most companies had some limited form. I'm pretty sure at that point I was using some form of AOL, either CompuServe or AOL.
Yeah, CompuServe for sure, yeah.
Yeah, so basically when the developer would send files, they'd crank up that probably at the time, I don't know, I hope it was more, it was probably like a 2400 baud modem or something crazy like that. And they would send the files, they would send them to the test department. The test department would download the files, they would burn them to a ROM, and then they would give the ROM to us.
Not bad. Of course, probably just carrier that over or mail it over or something like that. But
Sometimes I think once things got important to where they were going to be files that needed to be mastered, they might actually physically use mail. But in general, the internet was still working, so they would send a lot of the stuff electronically. It would just take forever to download. I think we actually, and I could be completely wrong on this, but it feels like we were using CompuServe accounts to download the files to, some other online service.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of fun to think about. I mean, I'm thinking about the time frame of about 93. And 93 was when I started seeing text internet, Gopher and Telnet and all that.
Oh, no, we were using FTP. You know what? Now that I think about it, because I know when I was in school, there were FTP sites that you could go to and, like, download files. So I'm pretty sure we actually had an Atari FTP site to where the developers would submit their code, and then the test department, the head of test, would then log into that FTP and download the code that was deposited to the FTP site. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was FTP.
Okay. Well, cool.
In like 99% of the cases.
Yeah, I'm kind of nostalgic for that. I'm a big early internet and BBS guy myself, so I love talking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Maybe there's more. You know what? Maybe, and this is going to be the third time I'm going to change this story because it keeps coming back to me. But it's also possible that there was an Atari BBS where people uploaded to. Something like that. But yeah, everything was done electronically.
Pretty cool. Well, hey, SpongeFox.
Yes?
Got another question for us?
Do you have other hobbies aside from game coding? Like, do you skate or do art or write music?
What are my hobbies? I'd say I'm an avid toy and game collector. So I have a pretty robust... I probably actually have more toys in my collection than video games at the moment. But nice. I collect a lot of random crap. And that generally means like toys and video games. So I have a lot of that. When I lived in LA, I'd definitely go to like the Anime Con and Comic Con and things like that. For whatever reason, they don't have as many of those in the Bay Area. Anything techie and nerdy, I'd say I'm into.
That is fantastic. So what kind of toys do you collect?
Probably 80s and 90s stuff. So there's a lot of flea markets. I mean, one of the nice things, like when you're in a relatively affluent area like the Bay Area, is that people's junk is actually pretty cool. Like even sometimes when I'm going to the store, I found all kinds of crazy stuff on the streets. So like I could be going to Safeway just to get some dinner or something, and I found like board games, like the Game of Thrones board games, just lying there on the street. I found ceremonial Ukrainian maces. I found wrestling trophies, like all kinds of just weird stuff. Because I think because the rents and everything are sky high in the Bay Area, that a lot of people get costed out, and it's too expensive to live here. So when they're moving, they just toss their stuff on the street, and then if you just happen to be rolling by, you can find all kinds of neat stuff.
Oh, wow. Hey, let me ask you this. Amongst all your toys and everything, do you have any game systems of your own?
So I've got all of the only thing currently that I probably don't have at the moment is the most recent Xbox and the most recent PlayStation and a TurboGrafx. So I think I got an Intellivision, Super Nintendo, 2600. I don't think I have a 5200, but I do have a ColecoVision, PS3, PS2, PS1, Dreamcast, Game Gear, few Game Boys. And I've had various iterations of all those. Like I used to have a TurboGrafx 16, although the one thing I do have, which is a complete other tangent, but recently, around 3 or 4 years ago, I actually went to China and partnered with a factory to make our own video game console, which mainly we sold in Latin America and India.
Huh. What was the name of the console?
It's called Motion on the Move. So it's basically a knockoff of the Wii. So it was a motion controller with maybe, 10 or 12 games built into it. And you could, wave the controllers around like a Wii, and it would track your hand motions. You could grip the controller, so on the screen you could actually pick up objects virtually. So it's pretty cool. But it's not like we had $1 million of marketing support. So like I said, we ended up selling it mainly to emerging countries like Latin America, India, etc.
Yeah, I got you. It's kind of like those systems that have like the 1,000 Nintendo games, or something
Exactly.
like that. Yeah.
So yeah, we were trying to ride on that wave. And before I did that, I worked at MGA, which was an actual toy company. So I had actually developed a lot of low-end video games that were like plug-and-play games. So we did one that was like Guitar Hero, and all the songs were built into the guitar. You just plug the guitar into your TV, and you could play like a low-budget version of Guitar Hero.
So did you actually do the programming on it, or what aspects did you work on as far as these little plug-and-play models?
You know what? I can't code my way really out of a paper bag. So mainly the same thing as I did at Atari: design and product manager, producer. MGA was kind of a unique place as well, in that we had to do 101 different things to get the product out the door. I don't know. I probably released maybe 100 plus SKUs of product there. We actually did those miniature LCD versions of old Atari games. So we did a version of Centipede, Missile Command, Asteroids. And then my old boss at Atari, from when I worked there at the Jaguar, his name was actually on the contracts that we signed to license the games from Atari. So things come kind of weird full circle.
So do you keep in contact with a lot of the old Atari folks?
Only a few, mainly on Facebook. I don't know if you know BJ West. I think he might pop up in some of the forums sometimes. Chris Hudak, he was one of the writers. Susan McBride, who ran the art department. James Hampton, I see him from time to time. Some of the developers, like Steve Mitchell, who developed the Highlander game, and Fat Bobby on the Lynx.
Oh, tell me I liked Highlander. Highlander was fun. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So yeah, when they were developing Highlander, I went over, and so that was one of the things where Atari actually spent money. They spent money to get the rights to do the game, and on the animation, and they spent money on setting up this motion capture studio in the UK, which Steve Mitchell ran. So I actually went over there and saw their motion capture setup, and that was pretty cool. That was fun.
So anybody else you keep in contact with?
Those are, I think, the main people off the top of my head. Actually, on the console I was telling you about previously, I worked with Steve Mitchell. So, like, he got into doing embedded programming for consumer products, like programming the firmware for maybe like a video game controller or something. So he knew the factory. So all three of us, the factory, him, we all partnered together to create this console.
How many units do you think got sold in the end?
I don't know. We probably did, 50,000 or something like that. But it wasn't profitable enough for the factory. So the factory made a lot of third-party peripherals for Nyko. So if you bought a PlayStation and you bought a third-party PlayStation controller, they probably made that controller. So those guys would be placing orders for like millions of pieces. So maybe they only made like 50 cents profit off of making them, but they were making millions of pieces, which in turned out to be more profitable than, say, making 50,000 of something that you had to fund yourself. So for them, the math didn't quite work, and they more or less have gone back to going back to being an OEM factory for making third-party video game controllers.
Well, if that's more profitable, I can definitely see that.
Exactly, it happens.
Of course, now that may explain then why we have so many of the game systems that are basically a game and a controller.
Yeah, so in southern China, there's a ton of factories that do a lot of these things. So Jax was able to obviously pioneer this market by the Pac-Man game. And then there was just a huge pile-on of cheap mini consoles that came out of China.
I've certainly seen some of those. Well, let's see here. Let me pull from my magic bag here of various comments. So let's see here. Okay. So we were talking about the comments in the source code. Let's get back to that just for a second. Rough description of what Hansel and Gretel can do. Oh, okay. One of the things that's very interesting, I noticed, we were talking here a second ago about, I guess, the outlet that comments are in the source code. Like, for example, they talk at some point about, in Hansel and Gretel, they jump up and they drop. I always thought they were apples. They're actually cherries, according to the source code. So they have the cherry generation, and under the comments it says, no smutty comments, please. So it's like, all right, I know you guys are wanting to say stuff about cherries. Don't say it.
Exactly. So apparently sometimes, I guess, they actually have a little bit of restraint of their commenting in the source code.
Yeah.
Have you ever vented when you were doing the coding and stuff?
Oh, I never really did any of the code. I just would review what the guys did and make sure that the code had no bugs.
And hopefully kept their comments clean in the code as well.
Yeah, I don't think I ever really, if I looked at the source code, I probably just opened the text file and skimmed through it just to verify that it was there. But not being a coder, I didn't know what any of that stuff meant, so it's not like I would have spent too much time laboring over it.
Here's another one, and I'm just sharing this stuff now. Like I said, I know it's been 20 years, probably forgotten it, maybe never read this, but I just thought you'd get a chuckle out of it. Under the Giant Boss AI, they had a little notation. I think it's regards to the bullets that the Giant would fire, and it says, is the wrong way around since the sprite was drawn the wrong way. And here's what was really interesting as I was looking it over, and you can kind of tell the time crunch that was going on, that it was being developed. Because like I say, they mentioned him as World 1 to World 5, Alice being World 5, so I guess that was the last one developed. And you notice that there's a whole lot of notations in World 1, 2. Of course, some of the stuff you could tell was recycled code. You had a knight code. It would be a cactus, but it would say the knight does this. So you're like, all right, so that was obviously recycled from this other part of it. Then you get to Alice, and the notations almost all but vanish, as I guess the deadline was coming to a definite crunch at that point.
Right. So it's possible that Alice might have been done last, and since it was done last, all of the knowledge had been accumulated to actually make it the best level, and maybe that's why it was like the first level or something.
Oh yeah. Now see, that makes some sense. That really.
But that's like a Nintendo ideology, and I just don't think that we thought things through that much. But it's possible that we did.
And here's another interesting tidbit, and I thought was very fun. Of course, Hansel and Gretel was mentioned to be last. The whole premise of the game is that you're trying to defeat, get the fairy tales back in place, defeat Hansel and Gretel, save Mother Goose, all this stuff, right? And what's really interesting to me is the fact that if you look at the source code for Hansel and Gretel, the person in the cage is not Mother Goose. It is the witch. That I thought was really fascinating.
So and this is another pure speculation comment.
Go ahead.
It's possible in the UK that Mother Goose doesn't mean the same thing as it does here. And thus, or their interpretation of Mother Goose in the UK is as a witch, whereas us Americans look at Mother Goose as like a kindly old lady. So it's possible that there's a weird cultural interpretation there and nobody caught it, and that's why it was that way in the game.
Now that's one possibility. Now, of course, my take on it was this: since Hansel and Gretel, of course, went out, found the gingerbread house, which had the witch in it, and the witch actually captures Hansel and Gretel, and in the end, they wind up shoving the witch into a stove and burning her to death. So I'm thinking that in this scenario, or the buildup of the scenario, Bubsy defeats them, World 3, so this is like mid-game, defeats them and actually saves the witch. And then, of course, he goes on to other levels.
Yeah, and maybe since it is the Fractured Furry Tales, which obviously was a reference to the Fractured Fairy Tales cartoon, it's possible a lot of these things had like a further thought put into them, but we just never got around to like explaining the joke. Like, when we first thought of it, it made perfect sense, but we had to keep moving on. So some things probably had a more thought out, fleshed out idea, but we never got around to like actually finishing up on those ideas.
Like, I guess the irony of a giant that was actually a mech suit with bell-bottom pants.
Right, exactly. So some of it was deliberately trying to be funny, but maybe things got lost in the translation or the time crunch and wasn't obvious to everybody that things were meant to be kind of slightly sarcastic and jokey.
Do you think it would be possible to make a like a revamp of Fractured Furry Tales with all the stuff that was originally cut onto PC? Fix it?
Doubt it, only unless you guys, the fans, did it. I doubt it because I'm not really sure, A, what the status of Bubsy is in terms of who owns the rights, because I'm not even sure who bought Accolade. So that would be the only way. I don't know what Andrew Seed's doing these days. I don't know what the other people that helped design the game are doing these days. But as a fan project, I'm sure it sounds pretty cool.
Well, I can say that it's been fun really learning a lot about Bubsy, and looking at the source code has helped me appreciate more of how the game was put together. So far, what we've done as a community is we've taken it, we found a way to decompile it, and from that we actually got to see some of the artwork, some of the music. Like I say, a partial bit of the source code was passed on to me from Songbird, so that's been kind of fun to look at. Interesting bit of trivia that we picked up from stuff that Andrew Seed brought up in the forums is that the map editor was actually a in-house designed program, and that's actually part of the fun of that. Between that and the character generators, I think D-Paint was what was used for drawing the actual characters, he said. But the map generators, that would be kind of interesting to try to figure out again.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why Imagitec was hired was that they had proficiency in being able to do 2D games. So I'm not sure that this is the case, but I suspect the editor that they used in Bubsy was also used in Dino Dudes. And that way they could kind of amortize the cost of development throughout a bunch of different games by using an in-house editor. And when you said that the cactus was the knight, I'm pretty sure that they specified probably half a dozen different character types and then repurposed those character types throughout the game utilizing different graphics.
Oh, yeah. It was basically like a guard is what it was. It'd be a guard, but it'd be repurposed for a cactus or a centipede, and then they would just change how the character movement rate was, a couple of other things, and of course what character panels it would access. Just minor changes. Here's a character, it'll guard, it'll look, and it'll move at a certain rate or fly or whatever. One last, I guess, notation in the source code, which I thought was funny. It was talking about the manholes. Of course, once again, taken from Bubsy 1, so you had the manholes that would fly up, and if you caught it right, Bubsy could stand on the manhole and fly up himself. And that actually comes in handy at least one time in Fractured Furry Tales. They say this, it says, kills Bubsy. Oops, that's right, Bubsy can't die. Or so say Nintendo.
And obviously at that time, there was always these jokes about Nintendo being, super kid-friendly. And, you couldn't have blood, you couldn't die. So people liked rubbing that type of stuff in, just obviously for their own amusement.
Oh yeah, Bubsy can't die. No, nobody dies in our games.
Just make a 3D version of it and make it really bad looking.
Make it bad? What, talk about making a Bubsy?
That's why I sometimes say when you make a video game and the character dies in one hit, I call it pulling the Bubsy.
I'm pretty sure a lot of people say that.
Yeah, Bubsy's been troped.
Yes.
I guess the last thoughts on Bubsy here, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about, I guess, what you got planned in the future. But to wrap up, what do you think of Bubsy as a character?
I think that when I got the project, actually I got the bulk of the Accolade projects at the same time.
Yeah.
So I was working on Bread Hull Hockey, Charles Barkley, basketball, Bubsy. I feel that there was something else, and I wasn't doing hardball. That's the only one I think I was able to get off my plate. But all of the other ones in that deal I was working on. So from my standpoint, they were kind of all the same. I can't say that I was like the hugest Bubsy fan, and there really wasn't the time or the money to be able to like change it up and mold Bubsy into whatever creative vision I might have had at the time. So it was just a matter of trying to make it fun and, you know, make it something that everybody would enjoy, and then not screwing it up since it was my first game and getting it out on schedule.
Yeah, and again, well done. You had it out by Christmas. So, do you recall what that vision might have been? Or what kind of touch you would have liked to add to it, aside from the fact that you made a completely unique game anyway?
Right. I think part of it was that we didn't want to do a straight conversion of the Genesis version. And I think both me and Imagitec had some other ideas. But like I said previously, there wasn't going to be enough time to try to finesse things in terms of the control or add a lot of different things to the game. So we just kind of had to make do with what we had to make, you know, the best version of Atari Jaguar Bubsy that we could.
Yeah, and it's what makes the Jaguar unique in a way. You know, for a lot of Bubsy fans, they can pick up the first Bubsy game on, you know, the Super Famicom or Super NES, the Genesis, the Mega Drive. You can pick it up on the PC, you know, with Super Bubsy. You know, you can pick it up all kinds of places, and Bubsy 2 was on various ones. But yet you can only get Fractured Furry Tales on the Jaguar.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. And
I'd say for maybe both better and worse.
Really? How so? Why would you say that?
I don't know. The one-hit kills are the worst, but the sprites and the gameplay, I think the sprites are better than the controls. I don't know. I just wanted to say something.
One thing I have to say on the difficulty, it was probably deliberate because we wanted to make sure that the game was challenging and wasn't something that people were going to beat in a day.
Oh gosh, I tell you, one thing I've really enjoyed, you know, many years of playing this and doing speed runs on YouTube with this game and everything, I enjoy that watching people try this for the first time and just not being able to get past the first level most of the time. And then you know, looking at my video and it's just me flying through it. And I've gotten all kinds of comments of, wow, you make it look easy and it's so hard. And yeah, it was. It really was. But it once you get the flow of it, it's really, really fun game.
Have you seen the angry video game nerd trashing of Bubsy?
Oh gosh, you couldn't get past the first gate. I mean, they spent like, what, 15 minutes on it or something like that, and they couldn't even figure that much out. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
I loved it. And there's a couple of other times I'll show up and I'll check out people's videos on it, and they'll trash the game, and I'm like, hey guys, if you need any pointers, I can improve your game if you want. And it's just so much fun just being able to just hone in on those skills, those gaming skills of a game that some people just can't hack. But then again, I can't really blame people because there are probably tens of thousands of games out there now. So if you can't get the game in 5 minutes, you know, you move on to another game. And I get that. You know, it's just, for a lot of us older gamers, either by lack of money or first couple of games we had and we just played the heck out of because we had a new system, that was just a great way to start off, and you really just dedicated your time to those games and got good at them. And for me, that was Bubsy. And eventually Cybermorph.
Right, and I don't think people, while I see people doing or hear people doing a lot of crazy things, like, you know, people playing Dark Souls with like a Guitar Hero controller or something, in general, because there are so many games, like you said, it doesn't feel like people spend the time. So when we were, like I said, when we were playing Bubsy, everybody that played it whizzed through it. Like, everybody could beat it relatively easily. And so even back then, I think we were concerned that it was too easy. And then it came out, I'm not sure that anybody cared one way or the other. I don't remember the reviews. The reviews were probably C+ to B reviews, as I recall.
They were pretty good for like the first couple of months. I mean, I think before people started passing on to each other, that was difficult. I think people liked the graphics and the gameplay and all that, and they were just like, oh, it's another game. And then I think, because I was actually reviewing some really early reviews on some of the news nets, Usenets.
Right.
And that seemed to be pretty much it, like 4 out of 4 stars or whatever. It was pretty positive for a little bit. And people were like,
yeah, and I think
love
people
that game. It was just hard.
I think people enjoyed the challenge back then.
They did.
And yeah, so I don't think that we felt we were in the wrong in making all these games slightly more difficult than it appears today.
Yeah.
I think people just controls have gotten better and tighter, and so game designers have more variety ways to make the game more challenging. Whereas before, we just kind of would just crank up the difficulty, just throw more stuff at you, make the bad guys faster, and thus it became a lot of hand-eye coordination versus like thought-out strategy on how to defeat the various characters. But I think for that time in gaming history, that's what the users enjoyed.
Absolutely. So, speaking about times then versus times now, what directions are you taking in the future?
Right now, I'm doing a lot of iPhone apps. So I do a lot of independent development on mobile games, mainly for iOS right now, but I'll probably branch out to Android because Apple's approval process is annoying.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And you have to wait a long time, and they make arbitrary decisions. So I might switch back to Android, where they don't review every little thing that you do, so you've got a little bit more creative leeway. And then looking towards virtual reality somewhat. So if I get my stuff together, I might try to develop some kind of low-cost virtual reality hardware, similar to what we did with the video game system I was telling you about. So something very affordable, sub $200 if I can find some low-cost screens.
Yeah.
Because that's really the difficulty, is finding high-resolution screens that don't cost a ton of money.
Well,
and then use Bluetooth controllers to be able to control the user experience on the screen.
Now, what do you think about the Android Galaxy with the glasses that you can snap the phone onto and actually make kind of VR goggles?
Right. So even cardboard VR, where you just I guess you can use an iPhone or an Android, and you can have a virtual reality experience, is actually pretty good. I think the Samsung Galaxy is a little pricey. The device itself is like maybe $100 and change, but you need a $700 phone. So that's ridiculous. I think that's cost prohibitive. And I think so far the best consumer solution that's going to give you the most robust experience is looking like the PlayStation VR. I think Oculus requires an expensive computer and too many cables and is a little too niche. The same thing with the HTC Vive or Vive. That has the actual best experience. It's the HTC version. But the cost on that, I think, is exorbitant. But Sony's sold already 30 million PlayStations out there. So it gives a good installed base. And I think that their hardware is like the best bang for the buck at the moment. But I think there is an opportunity for a lower-end piece of hardware, provided that you can provide the screen built into the headset.
So, sounds like that's a pretty good prospect you got going there. So, hope to hear more about that.
I mean, obviously, I got to raise some money and figure out the technical aspects, but I've got good factory connections in China, so I believe it's doable. It's just a matter of putting the plan together. And like I said, also make iPhone apps, so maybe one of those will take off and I can make a fortune on that.
Well, any last thoughts?
It's cool that you guys really like Bubsy a lot. When we were making it, I think we were just of the mindset of let's crank this bad boy out and get it out there and move on to the next thing.
Of course.
But it's cool to see that it's developed a nice little cult following, as it's cool to see that there is this huge cult following for the Atari Jaguar. When we were making that, we were just trying to figure out how we could like carve out our own little slice of the market and try to make it as successful as possible, working with the limited resources that we had. But now it's cool to see that a whole cult of Jaguar has popped up. I've seen like Atari magazines on the newsstand that have the Atari development team pictures in it and interviews with people on how the Jaguar was created. So it's cool to see that the system has kind of made it out of the video game graveyard and has a lot of appreciation on the internet in 2016.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the nice thing about it is not only do you have the classic games, but you also have games being ported from the ST, which was another 68K processor computer, like the Jaguar has. And, of course, ROM loaders and other things like that. So it's very much alive and kicking.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, I never would have expected that. Like, it boggles my mind that people are still fascinated with this machine, like, 20 years later.
That's cool stuff. Well,
yeah, it's great.
So glad that you could take the time to, hang with us for a few minutes, talk about the times back at Atari. Like I say, some of the ways you were talking about it was like we were there yesterday. It's actually quite cool. If
you guys want to do it again, obviously there's other games that I could talk about. Baldies, the Brett Hull hockey, the Charles Barkley, and just the general vibe of Atari back then. So yeah, if you want to know more, you can set it up so that there's a screencast and maybe make it more interactive. But let me know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I was looking at what you did back in Atari back in the day, and it was just like, yeah, we definitely need to get you in on some of the future podcasts. So, in the meantime, you have a great night, and
would you mind if I bring along one itsy bitsy little character to close out the podcast?
Go right ahead.
This is Bubsy Bobcat signing off, and what could possibly go wrong?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. That was great.
Take care of yourself.